Maya's heart raced as she stepped off the plane, her mind buzzing with excitement for the adventure that awaited. She had always dreamed of escaping the quiet life of her small coastal town, of trading the familiar for the unknown, and now, that dream was coming true. Alec, the man she had trusted completely, had promised her an experience that would change her life forever. And for a while, it seemed like a dream: sunsets on a remote island, the soft lapping of turquoise waters, and the promise of a future together. But as the days passed in this tropical paradise, something felt off. Alec, the charming man who had swept her off her feet, was slipping away. His distracted glances, cryptic phone calls, and constant disappearances made her uneasy. She brushed it off. Perhaps it was just business, something she didn't fully understand. But when Alec disappeared completely, and she found herself locked out of the villa, Maya's world began to crumble. Have you ever had that sinking feeling, when everything you thought was perfect suddenly starts to slip through your fingers? Well, Maya was about to find out just how dangerous trust can be. Thank you, my viewers and my subscribers. If you are new here, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our new videos. Maya had always been a dreamer. Growing up in a small coastal town, where the scent of saltwater hung in the air and the rhythm of the waves provided a constant soundtrack to daily life, she often found herself longing for something more. The town, though beautiful, felt stifling. The same faces, the same routines, and the same limited opportunities seemed to repeat in an endless cycle. Her family, loving but small-minded in their own ways, had always encouraged her to stay grounded, to find joy in simplicity, but Maya knew deep down that she was meant for something bigger. She was an only child, and her parents, both retired school teachers, doted on her endlessly. Yet, as much as they showered her with love, they couldn't understand her thirst for adventure. Her mother often reminded her, the world can be a dangerous place. You're lucky to have what you have here. Her father, on the other hand, had always wished she would settle down, find a stable job, and build a life similar to their own. They had spent years in this town, and in their eyes, that was the only life worth living, safe and predictable. But Maya was different. She spent hours scrolling through travel blogs, watching documentaries about exotic places, and reading novels about people who lived lives of daring escapades. The thought of exploring faraway places, of discovering new cultures, and of being swept away in the thrill of the unknown filled her with excitement. Her walls, adorned with postcards from various countries, were a constant reminder of the life she dreamt of, a life that felt worlds away from the small town where she had been raised. Then came Alec. He wasn't a stranger. Maya had met him through a mutual friend at a local party, a casual encounter that quickly turned into something more. Alec was everything she had ever wanted: confident, well-spoken, and full of stories about his travels to places Maya could only imagine. He didn't have the stiff, narrow outlook of people in her hometown. Alec spoke with the enthusiasm of someone who had lived many lifetimes in just a few years. He had that certain charm, a magnetism that seemed to draw everyone in. When he spoke, it was as though the world around him faded, and only his voice mattered. Maya was captivated, not just by his experiences, but by the way he made her feel. She was the center of his universe, the one he would listen to with rapt attention, the one he would surprise with thoughtful gifts and spontaneous plans. He remembered every little detail of their conversations, from her favorite color to the childhood dream she had of visiting the lush, untouched islands of Southeast Asia. Alec made Maya feel seen, understood in a way no one ever had. It was a feeling she had craved her entire life. But it wasn't just his charm that drew her in. It was the promise of something bigger. Alec didn't just talk about places, he made them seem tangible, attainable, real. He painted vivid pictures of private islands with secluded beaches, of cultures brimming with mystery and beauty, of people who lived outside the norms of society. To Maya, Alec embodied the adventure she had been yearning for. He was the answer to her prayers, the doorway to the world she had longed to experience. Over the months that followed, their relationship deepened. Alec began to talk about their future, how they would travel together, how he wanted to show her the world. He painted a life of freedom and excitement, one that seemed more fulfilling than anything she had ever imagined. Her family was skeptical. Her mother, in particular, worried about Alex's lifestyle. She couldn't quite pinpoint what bothered her, but there was something about him that seemed too polished, too smooth. "Maya, darling, you don't know this man like you think you do. He's lived in places that aren't safe, done things you don't understand. You need to be careful." Maya brushed off her concerns. Alec wasn't like the men her mother had known. He was different. He wasn't like the men who stayed in their small town and led predictable, uneventful lives. He was worldly, sophisticated, and full of ambition. He wasn't stuck in the rut that so many of the people around her were. He was going places, and he wanted to take her with him. Soon after that, Alec presented his grand idea, a vacation. A getaway to an exotic, far-off destination, a tropical island that was so remote it could hardly be found on any travel brochure. He painted the island as a paradise untouched by tourism, an undiscovered gem where they would experience the true beauty of nature and the warmth of the local people. To Maya, it seemed like the culmination of everything they had dreamed of together. The perfect escape from the monotony of everyday life. At first, Maya hesitated. Something about leaving everything behind, venturing so far away, made her nervous. But Alec reassured her, convincing her that this was the beginning of something extraordinary. "I want to show you the world, Maya. I want to give you everything you've always dreamed of. This is just the start." And so, Maya, swept up in the whirlwind of emotions and promises, agreed. Alec had already arranged everything, the flights, the accommodation, and even the activities. It all seemed so perfect, so meticulously planned. He had thought of everything, down to the smallest detail. Maya had no reason to doubt him. She was excited, filled with anticipation, and, for the first time in a long while, hopeful about her future. But as the day of departure grew nearer, Maya's excitement began to mix with a sense of unease. It wasn't that she doubted Alec's intentions, after all, he had been nothing but kind, charming, and supportive, but there were small things she couldn't ignore. He had become increasingly distant in the days leading up to the trip, spending more time on his phone, talking in hushed tones, and leaving her with little explanation. When she asked him about it, he would brush it off with a smile and a promise that everything was fine. Still, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a lingering sense that Alec wasn't being entirely honest with her. She chalked it up to the stress of the upcoming trip, figuring it was just nerves. After all, Alec had promised her the trip of a lifetime, a chance to see the world, to break free from the constraints of her small town life. This was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter. But as she boarded the plane, she had no idea that this dream vacation would soon turn into her worst nightmare. The days following Maya's disappearance were a blur of confusion and panic. Alec's sudden vanishing act was the first red flag, but it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would unfold for Maya. And for those who would later investigate her case. What had started as a dream vacation in a paradise island soon revealed itself to be an elaborate trap, one designed to ensnare her in a web of deceit and criminal intent. It was when Maya ventured into town that she first overheard the conversation that would turn everything upside down. As she walked down the narrow, sun-scorched streets, desperately trying to find someone who could help her, she caught snatches of a hushed conversation coming from a cafe. Two men were speaking in low voices, not realizing that Maya was walking nearby. Their words were chilling, each syllable striking her with increasing dread. "She's here. The buyer is looking to close the deal. They'll be ready to take her any time now," one of the men said. Maya's heart stopped. The words echoed in her ears, but they made no sense. The buyer? Deal? She turned, trying to make sense of what she had just heard, but her legs felt like lead. Her stomach churned with nausea as realization began to sink in. Alec hadn't just abandoned her. He hadn't just gone for a business meeting. No, Alec had sold her. That evening, as she hid in the shadows of the villa, her mind racing, her body trembling with fear, she tried to recall everything Alec had said and done. The trips he took, the long absences, the vague excuses. It all started to fit together like a grim puzzle. The perfect vacation had been a lie, an illusion designed to make her trust him, to let her guard down. The reality was far darker. Alec was part of a human trafficking ring, and Maya had unknowingly become a pawn in a dangerous game. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with anxiety and dread, Maya made her way to the local police station. Her first attempt to reach help was met with skepticism. To the local authorities, a missing tourist wasn't exactly unusual in a remote place like this. People came, they went, and sometimes they just got lost in the chaos of foreign lands. But Maya wasn't just lost. She wasn't some wanderer who had missed her flight. She was caught in something far more insidious. It wasn't until Maya confided in a local woman, Lonnie, who had noticed her distress, that things began to take a more serious turn. Lonnie, an islander who had seen her fair share of exploitation and crime, immediately understood what was happening. She had seen women like Maya before, lured to remote places, promised a new life, and then sold off to the highest bidder. Lonnie quickly became Maya's lifeline. She offered Maya shelter and helped her gather her thoughts, making sure she remained hidden from the traffickers who were surely looking for her. It was then that Lonnie took Maya to a local journalist, someone who had spent years investigating the darker side of the island, and the journalist took an immediate interest in her case. By this point, the police had started to get involved, albeit reluctantly. The authorities, it seemed, had been aware of the trafficking ring operating in the area, but they had been unable to stop it. The operation was deeply entrenched in the island's underbelly, with connections reaching far beyond the borders of this sleepy paradise. The police had limited resources and few leads, but Maya's case was different. She wasn't just another tourist gone missing, she was a pawn in a well-organized scheme, and this time, they had a face to connect to the crime. Maya's story quickly gained traction. The local media, which had often turned a blind eye to the island's criminal underworld, suddenly had a story they couldn't ignore. There was something about Maya's plight that resonated with the public. Perhaps it was the cruelty of her situation, the fact that someone she had trusted, someone who had seemed so genuine, had turned on her in the most brutal way. Or perhaps it was the fact that her story wasn't an isolated incident. She was a part of a larger problem, one that had been festering under the surface for far too long. The authorities, now under pressure from both the media and the public, had no choice but to escalate their investigation. The first step was to track down Alec. But Alec, it turned out, was nowhere to be found. His phone had been turned off, his social media accounts were silent, and his whereabouts were a mystery. It was clear that he had disappeared into thin air, likely knowing that the jig was up. The police, now working alongside local journalists and even international organizations, began digging into Alec's background. What they uncovered was more disturbing than they had anticipated. Alec wasn't just a charming tourist guide, he had a history, one that involved multiple aliases, multiple disappearances, and a pattern of manipulating vulnerable women. He had been operating under the radar for years, using his charisma and charm to lure victims into his web. And Maya, tragically, was just one of many. As the investigation unfolded, the police received a tip from an anonymous source. A local fisherman had seen Alec meeting with a group of men in the middle of the night, near a secluded part of the island. The men, who were suspected to be part of the trafficking ring, had spoken in hushed tones, and Alec had exchanged what appeared to be money. It was damning evidence, and it marked the first real lead in the case. In the days that followed, a multi-agency task force was formed, made up of local law enforcement, international human trafficking organizations, and undercover agents. They worked tirelessly, tracing every lead, piecing together the network that had operated in the shadows for so long. It became clear that Alec was just a small part of a larger, more insidious operation, an operation that involved multiple people on the island and beyond. The public's reaction was one of shock and outrage. Maya's story struck a chord with people around the world. Social media was flooded with posts from people who had been following her story, expressing disbelief that someone could be so callous, so calculating, as to exploit someone's trust in this way. Public outcry grew as the authorities struggled to track down Alec and bring those responsible to justice. Maya's family, back home, were beside themselves with worry. They had no idea where she was, what had happened to her, or whether she was alive. The police back home were contacted, and the authorities in both countries began to work together, exchanging information and leads. Maya's parents, who had always been overprotective, couldn't believe that their daughter, who had always been so careful, so grounded, could have been drawn into something like this. But they also knew that their daughter was strong, and they clung to the hope that she would survive this. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: Maya's story had ignited a firestorm, a call to action that was too powerful to ignore. As the authorities closed in on the trafficking ring, one question remained: would Maya be found in time? The turning point in Maya's harrowing ordeal came when the authorities finally tracked down Alec. The investigation had reached a critical juncture after weeks of intense scrutiny, dead ends, and mounting pressure. A tip-off from a fisherman had set the wheels in motion, and Alec's last known whereabouts had been traced to a small, nondescript building tucked away on the outskirts of a nearby village. It was there, under the cover of night, that Alec had been caught attempting to make a quick escape. Alec's arrest was swift, almost anticlimactic in the way it unfolded. As officers moved in, Alec tried to flee, but he was cornered within moments. His charm, which had so easily fooled so many, had failed him now. His face was cold, his eyes betraying little emotion as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. To the officers, Alec was just another criminal, one who had hidden his true identity behind the facade of a smooth-talking, well-traveled man. But to Maya, his arrest was the first glimpse of justice, a bittersweet moment that marked the beginning of the fight for closure. The charges against Alec were severe: human trafficking, fraud, and assault. The authorities discovered that he had been a key player in a human trafficking ring that stretched far beyond the borders of the island. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Alec, along with several accomplices, had orchestrated a network that preyed on vulnerable women from around the world. He used his charm to lure women into the trap, offering them false promises of love, adventure, and freedom, only to sell them to the highest bidder in a ruthless international trade. His actions were not just a betrayal of trust. They were a profound violation of humanity. The media, already buzzing with the sensational details of Maya's escape, descended on the case with fervor. News outlets scrambled to cover every angle, from the shocking nature of the crime to the questions surrounding how a well-spoken, seemingly charming man could be capable of such heinous acts. Alec's arrest became the focal point of a broader narrative, one that questioned the prevalence of human trafficking, the ease with which people could be manipulated, and the blurred lines between victim and perpetrator. In the days following Alec's arrest, Maya's name once again became headline news. The public, who had been following her journey with intense interest, now turned their attention to the legal battle that loomed ahead. Social media platforms exploded with posts of support for Maya, with many users expressing their disbelief and anger that such a crime could occur in such an idyllic setting. Online forums were filled with stories of similar experiences, with women sharing their own encounters with traffickers and predators who had lured them with false promises. The case had brought the dark underbelly of tourism and travel into sharp focus. The legal proceedings began in earnest just weeks after Alec's arrest. As expected, the defense team mounted a vigorous attempt to discredit the charges against their client. They painted Alec as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been in over his head, manipulated by forces beyond his control. His attorney argued that the allegations against him were exaggerated, that Maya had willingly traveled with him, and that there was no concrete evidence to prove he was involved in trafficking. Alec's defense leaned heavily on the notion of consent, suggesting that Maya had made the choice to go with him, despite the mounting evidence to the contrary. But the prosecution was relentless. They painted Alec as the mastermind of a well-coordinated trafficking ring that had exploited vulnerable women for years. They presented evidence that showed Alec had been using his charm to gain the trust of young women, manipulating them with promises of love and adventure, only to abandon them once they were isolated and vulnerable. The prosecution also introduced key testimony from Lonnie, the local woman who had helped Maya escape, as well as statements from others who had witnessed Alec's dealings with suspected traffickers. In addition to the victim's statements, the prosecution was able to present crucial forensic evidence that tied Alec to several human trafficking operations across multiple countries. Forensic investigators had traced the digital footprint of his communications, revealing a network of encrypted messages and payment transfers linked to criminal organizations. It was clear that Alec wasn't just a rogue actor, he was part of something much larger, an international network that exploited women for profit. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Alec's defense continued to challenge the credibility of the witnesses and the accuracy of the forensic data. They suggested that the testimonies were biased, that the prosecution was inflating the case to make an example of Alec. At times, they tried to shift the focus onto Maya, questioning her motives, suggesting that perhaps she had been complicit in her own victimization. The case took an unexpected twist when a former associate of Alec's, a man named Victor, was arrested and brought in for questioning. Victor, who had once been Alec's business partner in various travel ventures, turned out to be an even more dangerous figure than anyone had imagined. It was revealed that Victor had been involved in orchestrating several high-profile trafficking operations across Southeast Asia, and his involvement in Maya's case was far more significant than anyone had realized. He had been the one responsible for orchestrating the sale of women to buyers from other countries, using Alec as his intermediary. Victor's testimony was a game-changer. He claimed that Alec had been fully aware of the trafficking network and had willingly participated in it for years. He described how Alec had set up fake travel agencies, booked flights, and arranged for women to be sold to international buyers. The prosecution used Victor's confession as a critical piece of evidence to strengthen their case, revealing the depth of the criminal network that had been operating under everyone's noses. As the trial progressed, the media attention only intensified. News outlets reported every twist and turn, providing updates on the case as it unfolded. Public opinion was polarized. While many people sympathized with Maya, others were skeptical of the prosecution's claims. Alec's supporters, though dwindling, continued to argue that he was being framed, that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and unreliable witnesses. They called for a more thorough investigation, demanding to know who else might be involved in the trafficking ring. In the courtroom, tensions ran high. The defense team pushed back at every turn, casting doubt on the prosecution's evidence and suggesting that Maya was a pawn in a larger conspiracy. Alec's attorneys also tried to discredit the witnesses, including Lonnie, who they claimed had personal biases against Alec. The defense's strategy was clear: confuse the jury, create doubt, and present Alec as a victim of circumstance rather than the mastermind of a trafficking network. But the prosecution's case was airtight. They presented evidence that Alec had been a key player in a system of exploitation, one that stretched across borders and involved multiple accomplices. The combination of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the shocking confession from Victor left little room for doubt. As the trial neared its conclusion, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Public outcry against Alec was deafening. The case had become more than just a trial, it was a symbol of the fight against human trafficking and the exploitation of vulnerable people. For many, Maya's survival and the subsequent legal battle represented a larger struggle for justice, one that went beyond the courtroom and into the streets, where people rallied for the end of modern-day slavery. Finally, after weeks of dramatic twists and emotional testimonies, the verdict was delivered: Alec was found guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, anger, and disbelief. Alec's fate was sealed, and he was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the trafficking ring. But for Maya, the victory was bittersweet. The trial had brought closure, but it had also reopened old wounds. The emotional scars of her ordeal would never fully heal, and the trauma would stay with her forever. Yet, as she walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by her family, her supporters, and the press, there was a glimmer of hope. She had survived. She had fought back. And now, her voice, once silenced by fear, was being heard around the world. Maya's case wasn't just a legal victory, it was a turning point in the global fight against human trafficking. It was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, there are people who refuse to give up, who refuse to stay silent. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension, every seat occupied by spectators, reporters, and the occasional curious onlooker, eager to witness the dramatic conclusion to a case that had captured global attention. From the moment Alec was arrested, the wheels of justice had been turning at a steady pace, but it wasn't until the trial began that the full scope of his crimes became painfully clear. This wasn't just about Maya. This was about a network of corruption and exploitation that had preyed on vulnerable women for years. The trial itself was a spectacle, a media frenzy that left no room for complacency. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, jostling for positions to capture every moment. Cameras flashed continuously, capturing the faces of those involved, the accused, the witnesses, the victims, and the attorneys. The public had been glued to the story from the beginning, but now, as the court proceedings unfolded, they were about to learn the devastating details of what had truly happened. The trial opened with a fiery confrontation between the prosecution and defense teams. The prosecution, led by an experienced attorney known for his unrelenting pursuit of justice, stood before the court and delivered an opening statement that sent ripples through the courtroom. "This is a case of deception, manipulation, and human suffering," he said, his voice steady but forceful. Alec, a man who appeared to be a charming adventurer, used his charisma to lure women like Maya into a false sense of security. But behind that charm was a criminal mastermind, part of a network that trafficked women for profit, exploiting them in the most heinous of ways. This trial is not just about Maya. It is about ensuring that justice is served to all the women who have been victims of this predatory system. The defense, on the other hand, took a much more measured approach. Alec's attorney, a sharp and calculating individual known for his ability to manipulate public opinion, took the floor with a calm demeanor. He acknowledged Alec's arrest but vehemently denied the charges against him. "We do not dispute that Alec was involved with Maya and others. But this case is based on a series of assumptions, not hard evidence," he argued, addressing the jury with precision. "We intend to show that Alec is not the mastermind the prosecution makes him out to be. He's a scapegoat. A man who became ensnared in a situation he didn't fully understand. We ask that you keep an open mind and not rush to judgment based on emotion and sensationalism." The first major witness to take the stand was Maya herself. Her testimony was both harrowing and courageous. She described in vivid detail the relationship she had with Alec, recounting the early days of their romance, the idyllic plans for their trip, and the gradual realization that things were not as they seemed. Her voice trembled as she recalled the moment when she overheard the conversation in the cafe, the realization that Alec had sold her like a commodity. "I never thought it could happen to me," she said, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "I trusted him with everything. He was the one who promised me a life of adventure, but instead, he betrayed me in the worst possible way." The defense tried to undermine Maya's credibility, suggesting that her emotional state clouded her judgment, that she may have misunderstood the situation. But her testimony was powerful, raw and real. The jury could see her pain, her fear, and her strength in equal measure. Next, Lonnie, the local woman who had helped Maya, took the stand. Her testimony provided crucial insight into the island's hidden dangers. She spoke of the trafficking ring that had existed for years, the men who operated in the shadows, and the women who had been lured to the island, only to vanish without a trace. "This is not just a case of one man acting alone," Lonnie testified. "This is part of a much larger operation that has been exploiting women for years. Alec was involved, but he wasn't the only one." Lonnie's words carried weight, and the prosecution used her testimony to paint a clearer picture of the extent of Alec's involvement in the trafficking ring. She described how she had watched women like Maya arrive, full of hope, only to be swallowed by the island's criminal underworld. The defense tried to discredit Lonnie's testimony, calling her biased, but her first-hand knowledge of the island's criminal activity made her a valuable witness. The most shocking moment of the trial came when Victor, Alec's former associate, took the stand. His testimony, though reluctant, was damning. He revealed that Alec had been more than just a participant in the trafficking operation. He had been a central figure, arranging for women to be sold to buyers across the globe. According to Victor, Alec had been working with a network of powerful figures who had used their connections to smuggle women out of the country and sell them into forced labor or sexual slavery. He knew exactly what he was doing, Victor said, his voice shaking with the weight of his confession. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a willing participant. He saw it as a business, a way to make money. And he didn't care who he hurt. The defense tried to dismiss Victor's testimony, calling him a criminal looking for a deal, but his words had a profound impact on the jury. They had just heard from someone who had been involved in the operation, someone who had witnessed Alec's actions firsthand. With the testimonies completed, the prosecution delivered their closing argument. The attorney addressed the jury with a sense of urgency, knowing that this was the final opportunity to convince them of Alec's guilt. Alec preyed on women's dreams, he said, pacing back and forth. He sold them a fantasy, promised them love, adventure, and freedom. But what he really offered them was exploitation, manipulation, and pain. Maya is lucky to be alive. But how many others are still out there, trapped in this network of horrors? We must send a message that this behavior will not be tolerated, that those who exploit the vulnerable will face justice. The defense's final argument was less about Alec's innocence and more about creating doubt. His attorney insisted that the prosecution had failed to prove that Alec had knowingly participated in a trafficking ring. Alec is not a villain, the defense argued. He is not the mastermind the prosecution has made him out to be. He is a man who got caught up in something larger than himself. A man who made mistakes, but who did not deserve to be labeled a criminal mastermind. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension mounting as each minute ticked by. Maya sat with her family in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She had lived through the nightmare, and now, she was waiting for the final word on whether Alec would be held accountable for his actions. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, his voice echoing in the hushed space. We, the jury, find the defendant, Alec McFadden, guilty of all charges. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the room erupted in both shock and relief. The jury had spoken, and the man who had torn her life apart would now face the consequences of his actions. Alec's face remained stone cold as the judge called for order, but it was clear that he was being held accountable for the crimes he had committed. Alec's sentencing came a week later, and it was a moment of reckoning. The judge, having heard the gravity of Alec's crimes and the pain he had caused, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His actions had not only affected Maya but had left an indelible mark on countless others. The sentence was a message that the law would not tolerate such exploitation, and those who prey on the vulnerable would be held to account. As the verdict was read, Maya's family wept with relief, their months of uncertainty finally coming to an end. For them, the trial had been a painful journey, one that had exposed the depths of human cruelty but also revealed their daughter's resilience and strength. Maya, though visibly shaken, allowed herself a moment of peace. The trial was over. Justice had been served, but the scars of her experience would remain with her forever. The emotional weight of the ordeal was heavy, and while the conviction brought some closure, it didn't erase the pain she had endured. In the days following the verdict, the public reacted with a mixture of relief and outrage. News outlets hailed the conviction as a significant victory in the fight against human trafficking, but there was also anger at the system that had allowed such a ring to operate for so long. For Maya, the case was far from over. She vowed to use her voice to raise awareness, to ensure that no one else would fall victim to the same fate. The fight for justice had been won, but the battle for freedom from the trauma, from the memories, and from the scars, was only just beginning. The dust settled slowly after Alec's conviction, but the echoes of the case continued to resonate in the lives of everyone involved. For Maya, the journey toward healing had only just begun. The weight of her ordeal, the constant fear, the trauma, the feeling of betrayal, lingered, and no amount of legal justice could undo the damage. Yet, the conviction marked a crucial turning point, not only in her life but also in the wider fight against human trafficking, a silent epidemic that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. Maya returned home to her family after the trial, but the sense of normalcy she once knew felt out of reach. Her parents, deeply shaken by the experience, did their best to provide her with the comfort and stability she needed, but they too had been changed by the horror of what had happened. Maya's mother, once so protective, now clung to her daughter in a way that made Maya feel both loved and suffocated. Her father, a man of few words, had become more withdrawn, processing his own guilt for not being able to protect his daughter. In the months following the trial, Maya began attending therapy, trying to make sense of what had happened to her, and how to rebuild her life after such a profound betrayal. The scars were not just physical, they were emotional, psychological, and deep. She had nightmares about the island, about Alec's face, about the moment she realized that her trust had been shattered forever. But she also discovered an inner strength she hadn't known existed. Maya became an advocate for human trafficking awareness. Her story, once a painful secret, was now a weapon she wielded with purpose. She began speaking at community events, at schools, and on social media, hoping to raise awareness about the dangers of trafficking, about how easily people like Alec could prey on vulnerable individuals. It wasn't just about telling her own story. Maya worked alongside organizations that helped trafficking victims, volunteering her time, her resources, and her voice to those who were still trapped in the nightmare she had escaped. She understood, perhaps more than anyone, the importance of a network of support, of finding safe spaces where the trauma could be acknowledged and healed. Though she had a strong support system, Maya often wondered if she would ever fully heal. The memories, while not as sharp as they once were, still haunted her. In private moments, she would stare out at the ocean, remembering how she had once dreamed of traveling the world. Now, her dreams had changed. They were no longer filled with images of beautiful destinations and adventure but of survival, of redemption, and of giving back. As for Alec, his life took a sharp and tragic turn. He was moved from the island's local jail to a maximum security prison, where he would serve his sentence without the possibility of parole. The man who had once been the charming face of a romantic getaway, the figure of adventure, was now a shadow of that persona. In prison, Alec found himself at the mercy of a brutal environment. His charm and manipulative skills, which had once allowed him to control others, were now useless. He spent his days in isolation, unable to trust anyone. His former allies, those who had once worked with him in the trafficking ring, had either turned on him or vanished into the network of corruption they had once been a part of. The trial had destroyed his life, not just legally, but socially. His name was now synonymous with betrayal and exploitation. The man who had once traveled the world in search of adventure was now confined to a prison cell, his dreams shattered. Alec's appeal came a year later. His defense attorneys, who had fought for him during the trial, sought to argue that his conviction was flawed, that he had been coerced into a plea deal, and that the evidence against him had been circumstantial. They claimed that the trial had been biased, that media coverage had influenced the jury, and that Alec had been a pawn in a larger system that had framed him for crimes he hadn't committed. But the appeal was short-lived. The higher court found no substantial reason to overturn the verdict. Alec's conviction stood. He was left to face the harsh reality of his actions. His once charmed life was now a distant memory, and the man who had deceived so many was now imprisoned by his own lies. Maya's case sparked a conversation that rippled through the legal system, pushing for stronger protections for vulnerable individuals and more stringent punishments for those involved in human trafficking. In the wake of the trial, lawmakers began to review existing trafficking laws, considering harsher penalties and more resources for victims. One of the most significant legal reforms was the establishment of a specialized task force dedicated to tackling human trafficking in Southeast Asia. This task force, composed of local and international law enforcement agencies, began working more proactively to dismantle trafficking networks and provide support to victims. Maya's case had proven that, with the right resources and determination, human trafficking rings could be exposed and brought to justice. On a larger scale, the case raised public awareness about the vulnerabilities in the global tourism industry. Authorities started to put pressure on travel companies to increase their vetting processes, ensuring that they didn't inadvertently contribute to human trafficking. Hotels, tour operators, and airlines were now more accountable, and many began implementing new safeguards to ensure that tourists, especially women, weren't at risk of being trafficked. But despite the legal victories, Maya often found herself frustrated by the systemic nature of trafficking. She knew that while laws were changing, many people, especially those in remote areas, remained unaware of the warning signs. There was still so much work to be done, and the fight against human trafficking was far from over. The case had a lasting impact on the local community, too. The island that had once been a quiet, idyllic place was now under the microscope, with both locals and tourists questioning how such a crime had gone unnoticed for so long. The revelation of the trafficking ring brought shame to the community, especially among the residents who had unknowingly been involved or complicit in turning a blind eye. However, there was also a silver lining. The public outcry that followed the trial led to a surge in grassroots activism. Local organizations, with the help of international partners, began offering more support to victims of trafficking, providing safe houses, legal assistance, and counseling. The island's government promised to increase its efforts to combat trafficking and ensure that its tourism industry was no longer a cover for criminal activity. The community, despite its initial shock and shame, began to rally together to bring about real change. As Maya continued her advocacy work, she often found herself facing lingering doubts and questions. Was justice truly served? Could the legal system have done more to prevent crimes like Alex before they escalated? And perhaps most painfully, how many other women had been trapped in similar situations without anyone to help them? The debates surrounding Alex's guilt never fully disappeared. Despite the conviction, there were still those who believed Alex was a victim of a larger conspiracy. Some saw him as a mere pawn in a much more complex international trafficking ring. Others questioned whether the legal system had been too quick to label him the mastermind. These debates were not just about Alex, they were about the larger issue of human trafficking itself. The media, which had once been quick to villainize Alex, now turned their attention to the broader issue. Documentaries, articles, and podcasts began exploring the complexities of human trafficking networks, the ways they infiltrated legitimate industries, and the strategies they used to evade law enforcement. For some, Alex's case was a wake-up call, a reminder that the fight against trafficking was ongoing and needed more attention. As Maya continued to reflect on her journey, on the legal battle, the betrayal, the healing, and the victories, she found herself wondering, how many more Mayas are out there, living in the shadows, unaware of the dangers that lurk behind every seemingly innocent promise of adventure? It was a haunting thought, one that drove her forward, motivating her to keep fighting. The war against human trafficking was far from over, and it wasn't just about legal victories or convictions. It was about awareness, education, and dismantling a system of exploitation that spanned the globe. Maya knew this would be her lifelong mission, to ensure that no one else would ever fall victim to the same fate she had. And as she stood before a crowd of survivors, speaking out against the horrors of trafficking, Maya was reminded that sometimes, justice wasn't just about the courtrooms or the verdicts, it was about the voices that refused to be silenced. Thank you so much for watching this powerful story of survival and justice. We hope Maya's journey has not only captivated you but also inspired you to take action and raise awareness about the dangers of human trafficking. It's important that we all stay informed and keep fighting for those who don't have a voice. If you found this video impactful, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps spread this important message to more people, and we greatly appreciate your support. And in the comments, let us know where you're watching from, whether you're tuning in from across the globe or right in your own community. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation with you. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay safe and stay aware.